Some of our viewers are familiar with Christian Wagner, a member of the Vatican II sect and a defender of the Novus Ordo. We've refuted many of his false positions and false claims in previous videos. This video will cover many important additional facts in that regard. Wagner has been deceiving certain people with false assertions about Catholic tradition and theological history in regard to various aspects of the current controversies. Although Wagner says some things that are true, he makes many misleading and in fact demonstrably false statements about Catholic teaching and the theological tradition. His claims in that regard are very dangerous because many of his listeners simply don't have the familiarity with the sources or the issues to be able to recognize that he's not telling the truth. He also contradicts himself repeatedly on core issues. As an example of his false claims about theological history, Wagner asserted that all theologians taught that there must be a declaratory sentence for a heretic to lose authority.
There needs to be a declaratory sentence from the church for the heresy to be notorious, right? Or is there another way as well? There needs to be the declaratory sentence. That's something that all theologians are going to agree with, even St. Robert Bellarmine, as I'm going to show. In nobody's view does this follow. Nobody's view does this follow if there hasn't been that declarative sentence.
Well, that's not even remotely true. Many theologians taught that heretics lose authority without any declaratory sentence, as we proved in our video on Wagner and loss of office. Further, the position according to which heretics automatically lose authority is proven from papal teaching and the divine law. Yet Wagner, falsifying the theological tradition on this matter, claimed that not even one theologian taught that. It's absurd. See our video on Wagner and loss of office for more on that particular issue, but his statement was an example of how he will confidently make claims that are utterly false. He does that a lot. 1 Timothy 1:7 indeed applies to Wagner, quote, "Desiring to be teachers of the law without understanding either what they are saying or the things about which they make confident assertions," end quote. Wagner makes many similar false claims with regard to traditional Catholic teaching on salvation. Frankly, he has an agenda to deny Catholic dogma on this matter and to misuse traditional sources to bolster his false position.
The way in which we get around this, not really get around this, because I would say this is a traditional interpretation of this matter. This isn't something that, popped up at Vatican II. The way we get around this, I said that again, around this.
For example, he had a discussion with the Protestant, quote, redeemed Zoomer. Zoomer correctly stated that the teaching of the Council of Florence on salvation contradicts Vatican II and the Vatican II sect on salvation. Note that this does not represent a contradiction in the teaching of the Catholic Church because Vatican II was not a council of the Catholic Church, as our material explains.
Yeah, I can give you the exact quote. It says, "All those who are outside the Catholic Church, not only pagans, but also Jews or heretics and schismatics, cannot share in eternal life and will go into the everlasting fire, which was prepared for the devil and his angels." And it clearly anathematizes even Eastern Orthodox Christians because it says anyone who denies the filioque is anathema. And Vatican II and says, "The plan of salvation also includes those who acknowledge the Creator. In the first place, amongst these are the Muslims, who professing to hold to the faith of Abraham, adore along with us the one and merciful God."
Wagner responded to the citation from the Council of Florence by saying that you must interpret councils such as Florence according to what the theologians at the time taught.
You have to interpret ecumenical councils in line with what the theologians during the time taught.
Remember that Wagner not only believes that many Protestants and others who reject the papacy can be saved, but he also believes that Muslims, Jews, and other non-Christians can be saved without even faith in Jesus Christ.
What about Mohammedans and Jews? Are there any who say that Muslims and Jews can be saved by invincible ignorance?
Yeah.
He thinks that's perfectly consistent with what the Council of Florence taught in the Bull Cantate Domino, when it's obviously not. His argument is that the theologians at Florence really believed and taught what he and Vatican II do, namely, that not only can people who reject the papacy and other Catholic dogmas be saved, but that even Muslims and Jews can be saved. Putting aside for a moment that what's definitive is Florence's solemn definition and not the teaching of theologians, who were these theologians at the Council of Florence who, according to Christian Wagner, taught the Vatican II understanding of the dogma, which Wagner holds, according to which not only people who reject the papacy, but even Muslims and Jews can be saved? Wagner specifically and repeatedly mentioned Juan de Torquemada.
Actually, one of the architects of Florence, Juan de Torquemada, who's the greatest ecclesiologist in the medieval church, who basically was the guy who influenced Cantate Domino itself. So Torquemada, and again, this is like the guy who was at Florence, so he's best interpreting this.
Wagner is telling Zoomer and his audience that if you just read Juan de Torquemada, you will see that he teaches the position of Vatican II and Wagner. But that's not true at all. Of course, Wagner doesn't give any specific citations, he just makes claims that are not true. I've spent some time reading various things from Juan de Torquemada. In our video called Leo XIV's Huge Error Condemned by Famous Catholic Figure, we quote 9 passages from Juan de Torquemada specifically on the necessity of the Catholic Church and the Christian faith for salvation. Torquemada teaches 5 different times that no Muslim can be saved. He says it's impossible to be saved in the sect of Islam. He's also emphatic that faith in Jesus Christ is absolutely required for salvation, and he calls it manifestly heretical to hold that anyone who is separated from the unity of the faith of the Holy Catholic Church can have any hope of eternal salvation. Unlike Wagner, we give specific and verifiable citations for our statements about Torquemada. Torquemada did not teach what Vatican II and Wagner teach. He actually characterized the position they hold as manifestly heretical. This is most obvious when considering Torquemada's teaching about people who don't believe in Jesus, which was the focus of our video. But Torquemada also doesn't agree with Vatican II or Wagner on the matter of baptized heretics and schismatics. If needed, we can cover more about that in a different video, but the citations from Torquemada on non-Christians suffice to prove our point. Wagner simply misled people with his dishonest and false claims about Torquemada and Florence.
So Torquemada, and again, this is like the guy who was at Florence, so he's best interpreting this.
In our video on Pope Pius II, we also showed that about 20 years after the Council of Florence, that pope specifically taught that no one can be saved in Islam. The Church also teaches that Muslims are pagans. See the teaching of Pope Calixtus III. Muslims are in fact referred to as pagans by many Catholic theologians of this period. Remember that the Council of Florence defined that all who die as pagans, which includes Muslims, are not saved. So even though the Council of Florence's dogmatic definition, the teaching of a primary theologian at the council, that is Torquemada, and another pope shortly after the council, that is Pope Pius II, all teach that no one can be saved in Islam, and Wagner claims that we must understand Florence's definition according to what the people at the time believed, he still holds that Muslims and other non-Christians can be saved without the Catholic faith, contrary to all of the aforementioned authorities.
You have to interpret ecumenical councils in line with what the theologians during the time taught. So Torquemada, and again, this is like the guy who was at Florence, so he's best interpreting this.
What about Mohammedans and Jews? Are there any who say that Muslims and Jews can be saved by invincible ignorance?
Yeah.
It shows that Wagner has no fidelity to Catholic teaching whatsoever and that he's a heretic. The same applies, sadly, to other members of the Vatican II sect who obstinately hold the same position, and to many false traditionalists, including the SSPX, SSPV, CMRI, Fraternity of St. Peter, and more. They also hold the heresy, sadly, that people can be saved in non-Christian religions. Not one doctor of the Catholic Church held that heresy, and it's contradicted by an array of definitive papal pronouncements. The Church has repeatedly declared that faith in Jesus Christ and the Catholic faith are required for salvation. We will come back to the salvation issue, but let's look at another example of how Wagner is a deceiver. In our video on Pope Pius II, we quoted his papal bull Vocavit Nos to further prove that Muslims do not worship the true God. Pope Pius II specifically taught that when Christian churches were converted into places of Islamic worship, the worship of the true God was abandoned. In our video, we showed the Latin text and commented on it. The passage is devastating to Vatican II's false teaching. It states, quote, "The most beautiful churches which were invoking our Lord Jesus Christ and singing psalms day and night to him now call upon the horrid and abominable name of Muhammad, and abandoning the worship of the true God and imbued with unspeakable rites, observe obscene ceremonies." End quote. Wagner attempted a response to this passage by focusing on the meaning of the word cultus. Wagner confidently claimed that there's a very important distinction between adoration / the act of worship and the word cultus.
Because we'll see that this distinction between adoration and cultus is going to be very important, between the act of worship and then the institutions of worship, if we may. So what is he accusing them of when they're replacing the cultus of divine institution with something else? Accusing them of superstition. There's nothing here to indicate that this is actually talking about a change in the object of worship, or somehow an absence of the act itself.
He also showed a text on the screen that states, quote, "The cultus refers to the manner of worship, not the act or the object of worship. It is more so taken in the sense of a system of religious observances," end quote. He's making a rather bold claim here. He's trying to dismiss this devastating passage by arguing that the Latin word cultus does not refer to the internal act of adoration, but merely to the rites or external institutions of worship. But his claim is simply fraudulent. This is another prime example of how when Wagner is debunked, refuted, or stuck, he would just make something up. He will make up a distinction that's not present in the original statement, and thereby pervert the meaning of the author. It's sophistry. While it's true that the Latin word cultus can and often does refer to the external rites or institutions, the word is also frequently used to refer to and include the internal act of adoration or worship. Remember that Wagner's argument was that the meaning of this word excludes a reference to the internal act of worship and pertains only to the external manner of worship or the rites. Here are multiple examples from St. Thomas Aquinas himself to destroy Wagner's lie about the meaning and use of the word cultus. St. Thomas Aquinas, Summa Theologiae, Part 2.2, Question 94, Article 2. Quote, "For since outward worship, exterior cultus, is a sign of the interior worship, interioris cultus," end quote. Notice St. Thomas uses the word cultus for the interior worship, the interior act, the very thing Wagner argued that it's not used for. Wagner is just engaging in theological fraud in his failed attempts to defend the Vatican II apostasy. He's just making things up. Here's more proof from St. Thomas to refute his claim. Quote, "Therefore it is a sin to offer exterior or interior worship to idols," end quote. And the word there for exterior and interior worship is cultum, an accusative form of the same word, cultus. Other examples could be given from the Summa, but these suffice to demonstrate the point. These facts clearly demonstrate that Wagner is dishonest and that his argument is false. And note carefully that we are not accusing Wagner of dishonesty for pointing out that the Latin word cultus can refer to the external aspects of worship. It can refer to the external aspects of worship. Rather, we are accusing him of dishonesty and deception for his argument that the word cultus excludes the interior act. That was his argument, and it's not true, as we've proven. It's something that Wagner just made up in a failed attempt to respond to the quote from Pope Pius II that refutes his position and proves that Vatican II's teaching is false. Wagner also, of course, doesn't even try to address the fact that Vatican II esteems Islam, which is directly contrary to Catholic teaching. But without even considering Wagner's lie about the meaning of the word cultus, which we just debunked, it should be evident that his argument about the passage is false. If Pope Pius II had merely intended to say that the churches turned mosques had abandoned the external practices or system of worship that God instituted, but retained the internal worship of the true God, then the Pope could have merely said that they abandoned the rites or practices of the true church. He would not have said that they abandoned the worship of the true God, Veri Dei. Moreover, to put the final nail in the coffin of Wagner's argument, we already showed that St. Thomas taught that outward worship is a sign of the interior worship, and he used the same word cultus for both. So even if someone assumed for the sake of argument that Pius II were only referring to the exterior worship of the Muslims, and ignored for the sake of argument what we've proven about the meaning of the word cultus and how it applies as well to the interior worship, since outward worship is a sign of the interior worship, the Pope's statement that the Muslims have abandoned the worship of the true God externally means that we must conclude that the same is true for the interior worship. That is, they do not worship the true God. Wagner also quoted passages from Pope Pius II, including one from his letter to a Muslim ruler, a letter we had previously cited, which merely say that Muslims believe one God, not that they worship the same God. Those passages do not help his case or support Vatican II. Yes, Muslims are monotheistic in profession. That doesn't mean that they worship the true God or the same God. Indeed, Pope Pius II and other popes of this period held Muslims to be pagans. By the way, in our video on Pope Pius II, we also cited passages from that letter, which refute salvation heretics like Wagner, because, as mentioned previously, in the letter the Pope repeatedly teaches that no one can be saved in Islam, a truth Wagner rejects. Moving back to the matter of salvation, Wagner also made false claims about Pope Pius IX's involvement with the Second Council of Baltimore, which took place in 1866. In the process, he blatantly contradicted his own position and arguments. First, Wagner falsely claimed that every aspect of the decrees of the Second Council of Baltimore was looked over and specifically approved by the Pope at the time, Pope Pius IX.
It's not kind of how synodality is done now or how the USCCB runs now. No, this was actually something where every little thing was looked over by the Pope at his judgment, at his oversight, in order to ensure that everything went well and there was nothing wrong.
But that's not true. He's dishonestly mischaracterizing the situation. People like Wagner are also often unfamiliar with the distinction between something approved in common form and something approved in specific form. Only acts approved in the latter way, that is, in specific form, are protected by infallibility. See our article on the Holy Office for more about that. But in the case of the Second Council of Baltimore, its decrees were not approved in common form or in specific form, but merely revised by a Roman congregation, according to Sebastian Bach-Smith, a professor of canon law, writing with an imprimatur in 1887. Roman congregations, such as the Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith, are not identical to the Pope. The fact that a Roman congregation revises a book or a decree or allows it to be published does not guarantee that the revised work is without error or that it's an act of the Chair of St. Peter. An obvious example of how Roman congregations and theologians of Roman congregations completely changed their position on the theological status of something is found in the geocentrism case. So there is no specific form act of Pope Pius IX in which he approved the decrees of the Second Council of Baltimore. Thus, Wagner's characterization of the situation was false, and his argument failed. But it gets even worse for Wagner, much worse, in fact, because the statement of the Second Council of Baltimore that he cited actually contradicts his own position on salvation. Let me repeat that. The statement that he cited to supposedly prove his position and to supposedly debunk the opposite position contradicts his own position. To see why, consider that Wagner recently admitted that it's an error to hold that one can be saved by merely being joined to the soul of the church without being joined to the body of the church.
The second error, and this is an error that unfortunately I would say I stopped saying this around 3-ish years ago, 4-ish years ago maybe. I said wrong things on this. I shouldn't have said it. The second error is saying that it is merely necessary to be joined to the soul of the church without being joined to the body of the church.
Wagner is correct when he states that it's an error to say that one can be saved who is merely joined to the soul of the church without being joined to the body of the church. Indeed, the Bull Cantate Domino dogmatically defined that everyone must be in the body of the church to be saved. But Wagner fails to realize, or perhaps he doesn't even care, that the non-definitive statement of the Second Council of Baltimore that he himself quoted taught that certain people who are, quote, outside the body of the church can be saved.
God, who punishes or condemns no one without their own fault, although they be detained by this inculpable ignorance outside the body of the church. Yet if, with the help of divine grace, they have obeyed the divine commands, and those truths of the Christian faith which they recognize, will have mercy on them, lest they perish eternally.
Do you see the problem for Wagner? 1, he rejects as false the position that someone can be saved who is outside the body of the church, and he's correct on that point.
The second error, and this is an error that unfortunately I would say I stopped saying this around 3-ish years ago, 4-ish years ago maybe. I said wrong things on this. I shouldn't have said it. The second error is saying that it is merely necessary to be joined to the soul of the church without being joined to the body of the church.
Yet, 2, he cites the non-definitive statement from the Second Council of Baltimore to teach that some people can be saved who are, quote, outside the body of the church.
God, who punishes or condemns no one without their own fault, although they be detained by this inculpable ignorance outside the body of the church. Yet if, with the help of divine grace, they have obeyed the divine commands, and those truths of the Christian faith which they recognize, will have mercy on them, lest they perish eternally.
He contradicts himself because his position is false, and the passage that he's citing from the Second Council of Baltimore was not protected by infallibility and was simply wrong, as even he would have to admit. This is an example of how the false arguments of these salvation heretics like Wagner fall apart when scrutinized. They only sound good to their deluded audiences, who don't know the facts, don't have the faith, don't care about consistency, and don't want the truth. Their arguments fail because they are not based on the dogmatic teaching of the Church, but rather on statements that are not infallible. Wagner has in fact debunked and condemned himself with such blatantly inconsistent claims. Now it should be noted that the Second Council of Baltimore was only referring to people who claimed to believe in Jesus Christ. It was not teaching the blatant heresy that Muslims, etc., can be saved without faith in Jesus. So that's another area in which the statement of Baltimore is not consistent with Wagner's position, because Wagner doesn't even hold that faith in Christ is required for salvation. But its assertion that certain people who claim to believe in Jesus can be saved who are outside the body of the Church is obviously wrong, as even Wagner must admit. It shouldn't be a surprise that such an error was found in the Second Council of Baltimore because, as we've pointed out repeatedly, the breakdown of the faith did not happen 3 days before Vatican II. The breakdown of the faith began over 100 years before Vatican II, with errors against the salvation dogma being taught not by the Chair of St. Peter or the Magisterium, but in fallible acts and by various fallible theologians. That's why we must adhere to what the Church has definitively taught on this and other matters. The following clip is also revealing. Referring to the necessity of the Catholic Church for salvation, Wagner says, quote, "The way in which we get around this." He then corrects himself, clarifying that he doesn't intend to get around the dogmas of the Church, but then he proceeds to say the same thing again.
Well, the way in which we get around this, I mean, not really get around this, because I would say this is a traditional interpretation of this matter. This isn't something that, popped up at Vatican II. The way we get around this, I said that again, around this, Peter Diamond's going to use this and he's going to say, look, Wagner is, purposefully trying to get around the dogmas of the Church. Nonsense.
His statements in that clip need not constitute any part of our argument, but they are a further revealing indication of his heretical mindset and his resistance to Catholic dogma on this matter. But it actually gets even worse for Wagner. Remember that it's a dogma that no one at all can be saved who dies outside the Catholic Church or without the Catholic faith. That's what the Church believes and professes. It's thus blatantly heretical to say that someone can be saved who dies outside the Church. Everyone who is saved must die inside the Church. That's the dogma. Yet Wagner, giving his own summary of the statement from the Second Council of Baltimore, says this.
So these are people erring invincibly at the departing of their death, and they do not come to know the true Church. So these are very clearly people who are dying outside of the Church. God, who punishes or condemns no one without their own fault, although they be detained by this inculpable ignorance outside the body of the Church. Yet if, with the help of divine grace, they have obeyed the divine commands, and those truths of the Christian faith which they recognize, will have mercy on them, lest they perish eternally.
Did you hear that?
So these are very clearly people who are dying outside of the Church.
He says that these people who he believes can be saved are dying, quote, outside of the Church, end quote. That's blatant heresy. It's the opposite of what the Catholic Church teaches. To be saved, they must be inside the Church. His statement is analogous to saying that Our Lady had original sin. It's the opposite of what has been dogmatically defined. It's as direct a denial of the dogma as you could find. It's clear proof that Wagner denies the Church's teaching on salvation, and that's why he mischaracterizes traditional sources in an attempt to defend his heresy. We could cover more on the salvation issue, but these facts demonstrate that Wagner is a heretic, that he's not faithful to Catholic teaching on salvation, and that he's dishonest about various aspects of this issue. Moving back to the Islamic issue, Wagner has made other false statements and false arguments in an attempt to defend Vatican II's false teaching on Islam. In our video on Novus Ordo Cotumus, we showed that Wagner and others claimed that Jesus' words in John 4:22 about the Samaritans, quote, "You worship what you do not know," mean that the Samaritans did worship God.
So in John 4, it says, "You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews." Okay. So you have two different groups. One worships them what he who they do not know. So it says they do not know God. In the second group, it says that they worship what they do know. This second group does know God. Now, obviously, when it comes to this text, know is being used in line with how St. John normally uses it. Know is being used for that intimate relational term, right? But it affirms that both of these groups worship God. The Samaritans worship God. The Jews worship God.
And this is essentially what we say about Muslims.
We then quoted St. Thomas's commentary on John 4:22, in which he understood those words in exactly the opposite way. St. Thomas taught that those words mean that the Samaritans do not worship God because they do not know him. In Latin, St. Thomas even uses id est, which means that is, to precisely understand the words of John 4:22 to mean that they did not worship God. St. Thomas said, quote, "That is, you do not adore God because you do not know him," end quote. The position of St. Thomas is further confirmed by consulting Deuteronomy 13, where false gods are described as those whom Israel did not know. See our post about that. Since Wagner claims to strictly follow St. Thomas, and he's directly contradicting St. Thomas on the meaning of John 4:22, we actually thought that after we came out with this evidence, Wagner might change his position at least on the meaning of John 4:22 and whether the Samaritans worshipped the true God. But no, Wagner is even more dishonest than we originally thought. Instead of accepting the fact that his statement about John 4:22 contradicts St. Thomas Aquinas' understanding of the passage, and there's absolutely no doubt about that, Wagner responded by claiming that I lied. Incredible. In doing so, he committed a mortal sin. He violated the commandment against bearing false witness, because of course I did not lie, but quoted both him and St. Thomas accurately. Wagner was just upset that he was directly refuted on the point, and it was particularly galling for him that the refutation happened to come from St. Thomas Aquinas. Instead of accepting the truth about this matter, he chose the wrong path and responded by making a false accusation. It sadly reveals the alarming extent of his dishonesty. However, in expanding upon his false views about worship, he fell into even more errors and contradictions. The more these heretics talk about their false positions, the more problems they create for themselves, because only the truth is consistent. Before we explain more about that, note that in my video I specifically mentioned that before St. Thomas concluded that the words "you worship what you do not know" mean that the Samaritans did not adore God but a false god, he says that they adored along with God certain idols. St. Thomas's meaning is evident to an honest and attentive reader. He means that when people mix the worship of the true God with the worship of idols or false gods, the result is that the true God is not the object of their worship. That's because one must know God, at least by faith, to worship him, and people who worship false gods along with the true God do not have any faith in God. So in the first part of the passage, when St. Thomas says that they worshipped along with God certain idols, that doesn't mean that the true God was the object of their worship, but rather that they engaged in the external practices of worship that are dedicated to the true God, along with practices dedicated to idols, but not that God could truly be the object of their worship, for he concludes his entire point by stating that they did not worship God. When authors refer to people who worshipped God along with idols, but conclude their entire point by stating that the individuals in question did not worship God but a false god, the first part of their statement means that those persons engaged in the external practices instituted by God, but could not have him as the actual object of their worship, since they did not know him by faith. This is obvious. This point is made even more clearly by Father Cornelius Lapide, whom we also quoted in our video. Lapide stated, quote, "Because you worship the God of the Judeans with your Assyrian idols, and making God as it were an associate of idols, you therefore worship a false and fictitious God," end quote. Notice the words "you therefore." The Latin is ac proinde, which means "and therefore." Mixing the worship of God with the worship of idols results in the worship of a false god. When Wagner quoted the passage of Lapide that we had used in our video, he didn't even quote him precisely.
Ye worship God together with your Assyrian idols, and associating God, as it were, with idols, you worship a false or fictitious God.
He didn't use the precise translation that we provided. Instead, Wagner used an inferior internet translation that failed to capture how Lapide links his conclusion that they did not worship the true God precisely with the fact that they mixed the worship of God with idols. That's just another example of Wagner's dishonesty. The point that Lapide makes refutes Wagner's entire argument. This is not the first time that Wagner has used an inaccurate translation for a key text. Just like St. Thomas, Lapide's passage fully supports our point on John 4:22. Indeed, in the very same passage, Lapide directly teaches that Turks, that is, the Muslims, as well as Jews and Calvinists, do not worship the true God but a false god. That is directly contrary to the position of Vatican II and Wagner, Yet Wagner acts as if Lapide's passage supports his position on Muslims and whether they worship the true God, when the opposite is true. That's because Wagner is a liar and a deceiver. Even though it's obvious to true Catholics that you cannot have the true God as the object of your worship while you worship false gods at the same time, this is not clear to members of the Vatican II sect like Wagner. That's because they don't know what worship is, and they don't have a Catholic sense. In fact, on June 30th, 2025, Wagner directly argued that someone who is worshiping idols can also worship God. And by that statement, he doesn't merely mean that someone can use the rites instituted by God, but that that person can have God as the object of his worship while worshiping idols, for that's the whole point of this dispute. Other Novus Ordites have made the same argument. Being devoid of faith, they clearly do not understand Catholic teaching on this matter. To help them out, we will quote the 4th century apologist and church father Lactantius, who is praised by various popes and is even specifically quoted by Pope Pius XI in Mortalium Animos on the matter of worship. He is an authority on worship. He stated, quote, "First of all, it has never been the case that those who worshipped these false deities also worshipped God, nor could it be so. For if the same honor is paid to other gods, then he whose religion is that we believe that he is the one and only God is not worshipped at all." End quote. Notice, Lactantius directly addresses whether one can worship the true God while worshiping false gods. He teaches that it's impossible to worship God along with false gods, since the worship of the true God requires belief that he is the one and only God. He also correctly understands that worship is intimately connected to faith. This passage should cause Vatican II heretics to abandon their ridiculous position that you can worship the true God as object while worshiping false gods, but let's not be too hopeful. Another person who made the same true point was scholastic theologian Father Willem Hessels van Est. Concerning the, quote, unknown God in Acts 17, he stated, quote, "To the unknown God, here it might be asked, why then would they not have implicit faith if they worshipped as the true God, a God unknown to them?" Response: firstly, because the worship of the true God cannot coexist with the worship of idols. Next, because explicit faith in the one true God is required of all. Thirdly, because it is incompatible even with implicit faith if something is believed that is contrary to it, as it was to place this unknown God on the same footing with the gods of the pagans, that is, with false gods and therefore demons. For unless he is acknowledged as the one and only God, he is not truly acknowledged. End quote. This is a great and important passage. Like Lactantius, Van Est correctly teaches that the worship of the true God cannot coexist with the worship of false gods or idols. He also teaches that the pagans in Acts 17 were not worshiping the true God. By the way, he also uses the Latin word cultus clearly to include the internal act of worship, another example that debunks Wagner's lie on that point. Someone who doesn't have faith in God cannot possibly have the true God as the object of his worship. Infidels, such as Muslims, by definition have no faith in God. As Pope Leo XIII taught, he who rejects one point of divinely revealed truth rejects all faith. That's the Church's teaching. The very fact that Muslims are infidels proves that they cannot worship God as object. The problem is that heretics like Wagner don't understand that worship is not the same thing as a conversation or a linguistic reference to God. Here's an example of that misunderstanding on display from a Vatican II heretic whom Wagner has endorsed on this very issue.
So if we really believe that every time a Muslim said the word God, he's referring to some demon, and for the Muslim or some idol, it doesn't have to be an actual demon that actually exists, perhaps like the one that appeared to Muhammad. Maybe just some idol he's creating in his head because he denies the Trinity and he denies the divinity of Christ. If we really believe that, then the Muslim definition of God or the referent of God is different than ours. And so I could tell a Muslim, you're right. When you, the Muslim, say Jesus is not God, you're right when you say that, because by God, you don't mean what I mean. But we don't say that.
That is a completely fallacious argument that is rooted in his complete failure to understand the difference between 1, the meaning that the term God bears in many linguistic contexts/conversations, and 2, the object of worship. Yes, in certain conversations or debates with an infidel, such as a Muslim, and this could apply to other unbelievers, when they use the term God, they are referring to the true God, because in those contexts, the term God is understood by both parties to mean the Creator or the Almighty, prescinding from the Muslim distinctives. That's an agreed upon or mutually understood definition of God in such contexts. With that bare definition of God understood, the two parties can then discuss or debate what else should be predicated of the Creator. They can also disagree about what should not be predicated of God, meaning the Creator. But that is not the same as worship. Worship is an act of faith in which the object of worship is determined by one's beliefs about the object of his worship. That's the key distinction. Since Muslims have no faith and they believe things about God that are contrary to who and what He is, their object is not the true God but a false God, the one they have constructed in their mind. The same Vatican II heretic whose fallacious arguments Wagner has endorsed and promoted on this matter falsely claimed that the Fathers, Scholastics, and Medievals taught Vatican II's heretical position on Islam.
The Fathers agree with Vatican II on this point. The Medievals agree with Vatican II on this point. The Scholastics agree with Vatican II on this point.
He doesn't know what he's talking about, and we debunked his lie and false claim in our videos by citing a medieval catechism, St. Vincent Ferrer, Pope Pius II, and more. We mentioned that there was even more evidence on this point to further debunk the aforementioned lies, which are endorsed by heretics such as Wagner. Here are some more quotes from the period of the Scholastics. Father Serafino Caponi, scholastic theologian, stated, quote, "Although heretics do not openly worship the devil nor Mahometans, for thus the prince of the world was cast out through the passion of Christ, according to what Christ foretells, nor other infidels, nevertheless they worship the devil hiding under their fantasy, as long as they want to hold their fantasies as God," end quote. Father Christian Lupus, scholastic theologian, also stated, quote, "For in fact the Saracens, although they worship God as Almighty, nevertheless, along with Sibelius, make him out to be barren, and they deny that the Son and the Holy Spirit proceed from him, and so in their profane minds they reduce him to an idol. It is not the true God that they worship, but this idol of theirs. Hence, too, the Calvinists, who imagine God to be the author of sin, fail to worship the true God, invent an idol, and perpetrate a complete idolatry," end quote. Now we want to quote another pope. Here's Pope Clement XI. This is from his document Ubi Primum, proclaiming a universal jubilee against the Turks. Quote, "First, we have not ceased to cry out to God with our whole heart in our private sacrifices, that he might pour out his wrath against the nations which have not known him, and against the kingdoms which have not invoked his name." Psalm 79:6, end quote. This quote further establishes from papal teaching that Muslims do not worship the true God. The psalm that he cites, Psalm 79, is about nations that do not have the Lord as their God, and the Pope applies that to the Muslims. We should also note that Christian Wagner used a false translation of Pope St. Gregory VII's statement on this matter.
Because we worship and confess the same God, though in diverse forms, and daily praise and adore him as the creator and ruler of this world. End quote.
That's a false translation. Pope St. Gregory VII did not say that the Muslim ruler worships the same God, which would be eundem deum, but rather one God, unum deum. Yes, Muslims are monotheistic in profession, but they do not worship the true God or the same God. Also, Pope Gregory VII's letter was not a definitive teaching on Islam, but rather a diplomatic message to a Muslim ruler under whom Christians were living. The Pope was trying to be as tactful as possible, but he did not say that Muslims worship the same God. Heretics like Wagner used the aforementioned false translation to spread their error, which is another example of the bankruptcy of their arguments. Now, before we show that besides his many other errors and lies, Wagner has actually totally contradicted and debunked himself on the Islamic worship issue, keep in mind that the reason for this discussion and dispute about John 4:22 is that heretics like Wagner misunderstood and misused it in an attempt to defend Vatican II's false teaching that Muslims and Catholics together worship the true God. Yet in the process of trying to explain his position, Wagner made some rather surprising admissions. These admissions actually serve to destroy his position and the teaching of Vatican II, and they prove our point. For example, Wagner admits that if people worship according to their false notions about God, the object of their worship is not the true God.
So when you have incorrect predications to God, this is actually a predication which is not apprehending the subject at all in any way. This is the traditional scholastic teaching on the matter. So when it comes to these, when you have false predications of God, these false predications are of an imaginary being. This is a being which is constructed by by your own mental faculties, the phantasm that you have just constructed in your own image.
In line with this statement, Wagner admits that when a Muslim worships or refers to the, quote, God of Abraham who revealed things to Muhammad, the Muslim is not worshiping the true God because he's predicating something of God, namely that he revealed things to Muhammad, that is not true.
And therefore, when you are referring to those things, so let's say a Muslim said the God of Abraham revealed to Moses, revealed to Muhammad. The God of Abraham revealed to Muhammad. By God of Abraham, he actually is constructing an independent mental image. That's what he's doing. He is not actually referring to the true God when he says things like this.
Well, anyone should see that Wagner has refuted his position and actually condemned Vatican II with this admission. Again, just so everyone understands this clearly, Wagner admits that when Muslims worship according to their false belief that God revealed things to Muhammad, or according to any of their false notions about God, they are not worshiping the true God but a false and imaginary being. So, does Vatican II teach that Muslims worship God when they worship according to their religion and their false beliefs? Of course it does. All 5 daily Muslim prayers include references to Muhammad as the supposed messenger of God in the Tashahhud. Muslim prayers are habitually and directly connected to their notion that God revealed things to Muhammad. Nostra Aetate explicitly states that Muslims worship God in their prayer, almsgiving, and fasting. That statement obviously includes the Muslims' daily and habitual prayers, which are connected to their false notion that God revealed things to Muhammad and to their other false beliefs. To deny that is just to be a liar. Hence, according to Wagner's own position and statement, Vatican II's teaching is false.
So let's say a Muslim said the God of Abraham revealed to Moses, revealed to Muhammad. The God of Abraham revealed to Muhammad. By God of Abraham, he actually is constructing an independent mental image. That's what he's doing. He is not actually referring to the true God when he says things like this.
He has refuted himself, as any honest person can see. That's because he's a heretic and he doesn't have the truth or the faith. That's also why he promotes the utter apostate antipope Leo XIV as awesome and unstoppable, even though Leo XIV promotes religious indifferentism and the, quote, LGBT agenda. Despite the clarity of these points and conclusions, Wagner is so dishonest that he might even try to argue that when Vatican II and the Vatican II antipopes teach that Muslims worship God in their prayers, almsgiving, and fasting, that doesn't include any of the Islamic daily prayers or other acts that are connected to their false beliefs about God. But that would be absurd, and it would just further show that he's a liar. There are also many quotes from the Vatican II antipopes in which they teach that Muslims worship God, the same God, etc., when they practice their false religion in mosques, etc. To give just one example, on May 6, 2001, in the mosque in Damascus, Antipope John Paul II referred to it as a renowned place of prayer. He also called them believers, which is heresy. He also said, quote, both Muslims and Christians prize their places of prayer as oases where they meet the all-merciful God on the journey to eternal life, end quote. So John Paul II clearly taught that in their mosques, Muslims worship and meet the all-merciful God. Does that worship in the mosque include when they pray with their false notions about Muhammad, the Quran, etc.? Of course it does. To claim otherwise, as Wagner might, is absurd. Further, Wagner has adopted this idea that when an infidel, such as a Muslim, makes an intentional act according to his false belief, that he is not worshiping God, but that the same infidel, when he is intentional with regard to something true about God, such as that he's almighty, he is worshiping the true God. According to that false position of Wagner, a Muslim could go back and forth from worshiping the true God to worshiping a false God within the course of the very same prayer. But that's nonsense. Wagner has adopted this false position because he doesn't know what worship is, and he doesn't have the faith. He fails to realize that worship is an act of faith, as St. Thomas and others teach, and that the object of worship is determined by one's beliefs. Indeed, here's what Wanda Torquemada, whom we discussed earlier, said about worship. Quote, faith is the beginning of those things which are required for religion because every religion or worship of God is a certain profession of faith, end quote. Someone cannot have God as the actual object of his worship if he doesn't have faith in God. God is invisible, and one must know him by faith in order to worship him as object. As St. Thomas said about the meaning of John 4:22, quote, that is, you do not adore God because you do not know him, end quote. Infidels such as Muslims don't actually have any faith. Thus, they cannot worship God as object. On this matter, see the quotes we covered earlier from Van Est and Lactantius. We've more than sufficiently exposed Wagner's lies and contradictions and debunked his false theology, but there's more. In the process of making his false arguments, Wagner is also dishonest about the meaning of superstition. He tells his audience that when St. Thomas and other scholastic authors use the term superstition, that refers to the worship of the true God, but in a mode or manner that was not divinely instituted. He's clearly giving the impression that that's how the term is always used.
So superstition consists in worship of the true God. So you actually have the worship of God and the worship of true God. This is not done by divine institution.
But that's another half-truth, which results in a misleading conclusion. It's another example of how Wagner's dishonesty about these matters is dangerous. While it's true that superstition is sometimes used by scholastic authors to refer to a person who, in the view of the authors, directs worship to the true God in an inappropriate manner, the term superstition is often used to refer to idolatry. This is important to recognize because Wagner has dishonestly created the impression that whenever you see the word superstition, that refers to the worship of the true God in an undue manner, but that's not true, and unlike him, we will prove our claim. First, St. Thomas treats idolatry as a species of the genus superstition. See Summa, Part 2 to question 94. In that article, he also says, quote, on the contrary, it is related, Acts 17:16, that when Paul awaited Silas and Timothy at Athens, his spirit was stirred within him, seeing the whole city given to idolatry. And further on, Acts 17:22, he says, ye men of Athens, I perceive that in all things you are too superstitious. Therefore, idolatry belongs to superstition, end quote. Notice, St. Thomas directly calls idolatry superstition here. Hence, it's not true that whenever you see the term superstition, that it refers to the worship of the true God in an inappropriate manner. The term is often used to refer to idolatry or the worship of a false god. This text is also very important because it proves that St. Thomas, just like Van Est, whom we quoted earlier, did not believe that the pagans in Acts 17 were worshiping God as object. St. Thomas refers to Acts 17:22, which is intimately connected to Acts 17:23, and St. Thomas calls what they were doing idolatrous superstition. Before moving on, it should be noted that Wagner, in the midst of making his false arguments and claims, admitted that the worship of Protestants and other non-Catholics is superstitious.
When it comes to Protestants, so when it comes to heretics, when it comes to schismatics, when it comes to those of false religions, okay? And actually that word false religion right there even indicates what I'm about to say. All of these are committing acts, at least materially, of superstition.
Well, that admission also debunks his own position, because the Vatican II sect officially teaches that people are allowed to participate in non-Catholic and Protestant worship. See the directory on ecumenism and our video Vatican II is a New Religion. Wagner has thus unwittingly admitted that his own Vatican II sect endorses superstition. It's also very interesting that in October of 2025, the Vatican, for the first time ever, approved a special room that is dedicated to Islamic worship on Vatican grounds. This is an evil act of apostasy that contradicts what the popes have taught about Islam. It's more proof of what we've covered about the Vatican II sect. It's not the Catholic Church, but the prophesied end times counterchurch. This is the demonic entity and the counterfeit sect that Wagner attempts without success to defend. We also don't think it's just a coincidence that this unprecedented move was made shortly after there was months of discussion and debate on social media about Vatican II's teaching on Islam, whether it's consistent with tradition, etc. God allowed this to happen as another clear sign that the defenders of the Vatican II sect are wrong and that they are defending an evil and apostate counterchurch. Now let's look at a few more examples of how Wagner contradicts and refutes himself. We saw that Wagner admitted that when people worship God according to their false notion about God, such as that he is corporeal, circumscribed, etc., they are not worshiping God.
When they have a false understanding of God, in direct and intentional act towards a false understanding of God, they would say that this is an act of idolatry because it is directed towards a false being. So God is very unlike creatures in this way. You're not having false conceptions and being able to have this be of the true God. So when you have incorrect predications to God, this is actually a predication which is not apprehending the subject at all in any way. This is the traditional scholastic teaching on the matter. So when it comes to these, when you have false predications of God, these false predications are of an imaginary being. This is a being which is constructed by by your own mental faculties, the phantasm that you have just constructed in your own image. And therefore, when you are referring to those things, so let's say a Muslim said the God of Abraham revealed to Moses, revealed to Muhammad. The God of Abraham revealed to Muhammad. By God of Abraham, he actually is constructing an independent mental image. That's what he's doing. He is not actually referring to the true God when he says things like this.
However, after firmly promoting that principle in his astounding blindness, Wagner then cited commentaries on John 4:22 from theologians who taught that Samaritans worshipped God as corporeal, circumscribed, etc. And Wagner cites those passages to argue that the Samaritans worshipped the true God. Let me repeat that. He cites them to argue that they worshipped the true God. Here's an example from his quotation of Denis the Carthusian.
Quote, "You Samaritans worship what you do not know, for they worshipped God, the creator of all things." Interesting. "Whom they did not know." That is, they thought badly and falsely about him. So they worshipped God, the creator of all things. And when we say they don't know him, we're saying that they thought badly about him, thinking God to be corporeal, circumscribed, and fashioned with bodily ligaments. They also worshipped idols, which they did not know, thinking some divinity was present in them, which were full of demons. So not only did they worship God, the creator of all things, they also worshipped idols.
Do you see the contradiction and the problem for Wagner? Anyone who can follow an argument and is honest should see that Wagner has again refuted himself. He says, 1, that if you worship according to your false idea about God, for example, that he is circumscribed, then you are not worshiping God.
When they have a false understanding of God, in direct and intentional act towards a false understanding of God, they would say that this is an act of idolatry because it is directed towards a false being. So God is very unlike creatures in this way. You're not having false conceptions and being able to have this be of the true God.
But 2, he cites Denis the Carthusian and others to teach that the Samaritans worshipped God as corporeal, circumscribed, etc.
Thinking God to be corporeal, circumscribed, and fashioned with bodily ligaments.
And he concludes that the Samaritans thereby worshipped the true God.
So not only did they worship God, the creator of all things,
it's a blatant contradiction. This is an example of how the devil is using heretics like Wagner to confuse and conflate the worship of false gods with the worship of the one true God. If we assume that Denis the Carthusian and other scholastic authors understood the principle that if you worship according to your false notions, such as that God is circumscribed, then you are not worshiping the true God, the very passage that Wagner cites proves that the Samaritans did not worship the true God as object, but a false god. Denis's statement that they worshiped the Creator as corporeal while worshiping idols as well should be understood to mean that they engaged in the external practices dedicated to the God of Israel, but not that they had the true God as the object of their worship, since they held substantially false ideas about him that are incompatible with true faith and worship of God as object. So this quote from Denis the Carthusian doesn't help Wagner. It just further exposes his position as false and contradictory. The same thing happens when he cites St. Bonaventure on John 4:22.
Now let's go to St. Bonaventure. St. Bonaventure, he says, "You worship what you do not know, since you do not have the law. Furthermore, you worship both gods and idols and believe that God is a local deity." 2 Kings 17 says of the Samaritans that they serve the God of the earth and their idols. What does that say? I don't know. What could it possibly mean? Who knows?
Wagner again fails to recognize that he is contradicting himself. Here's a more precise translation of Bonaventure's passage. Quote, "You adore what you do not know because you do not have the law. Likewise, you simultaneously worship God and idols, and you believe God to be local. In 4 Kings 17, it is said concerning the Samaritans that they served the God of the land and their idols." End quote. St. Bonaventure teaches that the Samaritans worshipped God and idols while believing that God is local. Can you worship the true God as object while believing that God is merely local? No. Wagner admits this, as we've already proven.
So God is very unlike creatures in this way. You're not having false conceptions and being able to have this be of the true God. So when you have incorrect predications to God, this is actually a predication which is not apprehending the subject at all in any way. This is the traditional scholastic teaching on the matter. So when it comes to these, when you have false predications of God, these false predications are of an imaginary being.
Yet the heretic Wagner simultaneously cites this passage from Bonaventure to argue that the Samaritans, while believing that God is merely local, had the true God as the object of their worship. Anyone can see that he's again contradicting himself. St. Bonaventure understood that you cannot have the true God as object of worship while believing that he is merely local and while worshiping idols. His statement that you simultaneously worship God and idols while believing that God is local simply refers to their employment of the name of the God of Israel and the external practices dedicated to him, while they also worshipped idols. Not that they could actually have the true God as the object of their worship when they did not know him. Indeed, in his final sentence, he says that they served the God of the land, further indicating that the actual object of their worship was a localized false deity. Moreover, since this discussion about the meaning of John 4:22 is really just a proxy war for the dispute about whether Muslims worship the same God as Christians, it's very interesting to consider another passage on that matter that was written during the life of St. Bonaventure. It comes from a work called the Compendium of Theological Truth, which is found in an old Latin tome of St. Bonaventure's works. For a long time, this work was attributed to St. Bonaventure himself, but modern scholarship has concluded that it was actually written by a different scholastic theologian, Hugh Rippolin of Strasbourg, a Dominican, around the year 1268, during St. Bonaventure's life. Here's what Hugh Rippolin, a contemporary of St. Bonaventure, said in his work that was used as a theological textbook for centuries and frequently attributed to St. Bonaventure. Quote, "The first precept has 3 clauses. The first is, 'You shall not have strange gods before me.' According to the allegorical sense, the first clause of this commandment shows the Jews and the Saracens to be idolaters who have strange gods." End quote. So there you have another scholastic theologian, a contemporary of St. Bonaventure, directly teaching that the Jews and the Muslims do not worship the true God, but are idolaters who worship a false god. This was not only the common teaching and promoted in theological schools, but it was considered to be so consistent with St. Bonaventure's own thought that this work for a long time was directly attributed to St. Bonaventure. Hence, these facts clearly show that Wagner's position and his arguments are false. Wagner has also made misleading statements about a debate. Wagner has never written to me and challenged me to a debate. In fact, he has repeatedly said that he would not debate me.
I can't find. Oh, there it is. Jay Dyer won't debate Peter Diamond. Jay Dyer debate Peter Diamond. Somebody created a whole account just to come and, I don't blame you. But everybody always tells me to debate Peter Diamond. I'm like, no, I'm not doing it.
Well, I mean, that's like you're saying with like the other guy, the weird non-canonical dude saying you need to debate him, the Orthodox person. Like certain people, it's not really worth it because
the only thing that Wagner claimed to others that he was willing to debate is the consensus of theologians, but that's not a reasonable offer because, 1, we don't deny that a certain consensus of theologians, that is when they are universal and constant, is a witness to the teaching of the Church, and 2, his inaccurate understanding of that principle is directly connected to his main argument for, quote, baptism of desire. So his, quote, offer was essentially an attempt to debate baptism of desire while limiting the debate to his main argument. Even though Wagner is wrong in his understanding of the authority of theologians, and we've already refuted him on that point, an actual debate on the salvation or baptism issue must allow our side to also present arguments and the various insuperable problems with the BOD idea, rather than just refuting him and responding to his main argument the entire time. So no, he has not said that he would debate any of the main issues. But to make a brief comment about the matter of theologians, after we mentioned the distinction between the teaching of theologians and the magisterium, Wagner claimed that our statement was wrong, and in fact was our, quote, central error.
And this has to do with the central error that I'm going to bring forth tonight. This is an error of De Locis. This is an error of how we determine, how we demonstrate theological positions. So these are the 2 reasons he gives. This is important to acknowledge because 1, it once highlights the distinction between the teaching of the theologians and the magisterium.
But this is another example of how Wagner falls into errors because he's not rooted in the teaching of the magisterium. What we said is perfectly true and is in fact the official teaching of Pope Pius XII. Wagner was clearly unfamiliar with the teaching of Pope Pius XII in Humani Generis, which we were simply repeating. Quote, "The divine Redeemer has entrusted the authentic interpretation of this deposit of faith neither to individual members of Christ's faithful, nor to theologians themselves, but to the Church's magisterium alone." End quote. In his encyclical to the entire Church, Pope Pius XII teaches that theologians are distinct from the magisterium, exactly what we taught. Since Wagner doesn't understand the Catholic faith, he falsely called our perfectly true and accurate statement a, quote, central error. What a mistake. This is an example of how our doctrinal positions are actually irrefutable. They are all based directly on the authoritative teaching of the Chair of St. Peter. Any attempt to refute them involves condemning the authoritative teaching of the popes. Wagner's false view that the fallible teaching of theologians is essentially the proximate rule of faith in the magisterium is one of his central errors, and it serves to poison his entire methodology. It's a man-centered methodology. Like so many others, it's a manifestation of his worship of man, by which he is inclined to treat fallible men as if they have the same divine protections as the Chair of St. Peter when they do not. Yes, we can learn from theologians, and I spend a lot of time reading and quoting them. They are very often correct, but they can and have been wrong. They are not the magisterium, and it's only when they are universal and constant on a matter that their view necessarily and absolutely reflects the binding teaching of the Church. Since Wagner is a worshipper of man with no divine faith, he doesn't understand that. That's also why he will side with liberal heretics who taught that Muslims, Jews, etc. can be saved without the Catholic faith, rather than believing what Pope Eugene IV definitively proclaimed from the Chair of St. Peter. He's inclined to the teaching of men rather than the teaching of the Chair of St. Peter, which has a special protection from God. Many other examples of Wagner's dishonesty could be given. For example, in July of 2024, he had a brief debate with Jay Dyer. Wagner hyped the debate by claiming that Dyer cried and ran away, as we see here. But is that what happened? No, it isn't. Again, we are obviously not fans of the heretic Jay Dyer, as people know, and we're not saying that he defended the true position in their less than 10-minute exchange. But the fact is that Dyer didn't cry and he didn't run away. In fact, one might argue that Wagner ran away because Wagner abruptly kicked Dyer out of the live stream. Wagner's last words before kicking Dyer off the stream were, "Eat blank, Jay, get out," and then he cut him off.
Relations of opposition is not relations.
Get out. What a stupid sophist. Absolute nonsense. Get this guy out of here.
And yet, in regard to that, Wagner claimed that Dyer cried and ran away. It's another example of how Wagner doesn't tell the truth. He lies when he thinks it's to his benefit. We should also note that before we had ever mentioned anything about Wagner, he had attacked us repeatedly with unjust and false statements. He also tried to have my debate on sedevacantism banned because he recognized that it made their position look false, which it is.
So, yesterday, we all witnessed something horrific. We all witnessed, I think, one of the first murders to ever be live streamed and retained on YouTube. It was pretty bad.
To be perfectly honest, Frat should just take it down. This debate should not stay up.
Despite the fact that he had unjustly attacked us before we had ever even commented on him, we still wrote to him cordially and charitably informed him that he says some true things, but he adheres to false positions on other matters, etc. At the time, we didn't intend to post any videos about him. In response, however, he posted many things about us, including many false arguments, vicious false accusations, etc. Hence, this refutation of his errors, contradictions, and diabolical lies was necessary. We truly hope for Wagner's conversion, but the fact is that he's an evil heretic headed for hell who does not have the Catholic faith. He's a man who believes that anti-Pope Leo XIV, who endorses same-sex, quote, blessings, a, quote, gay pilgrimage in the Vatican, James Martin, false ecumenism, Assisi, the Abu Dhabi Declaration, etc., is awesome and unstoppable. Someone who thinks that is evil. Wagner has also said that he thinks that Francis not only could have been saved, but is worthy of veneration after his death. He thereby calls evil good and good evil. That makes him an abomination. See Proverbs 17:15 and Isaiah 5:20. Wagner is a fake convert who never believed in the Catholic Church's teaching, such as that there's no salvation outside the Catholic Church.
The way in which we get around this, I mean, not really get around this, because I would say this is a traditional interpretation of this matter. This isn't something that, popped up at Vatican II. The way we get around this, I said that again, around this.
And he leads people into heresy and hell with his lies, heresies, and sophistry. He's not the only person to whom this applies, but he was moved into the Vatican II sect not that long ago from Protestantism by the devil for the purpose of propping up Vatican II and trying to give people the false impression that the Vatican II apostasy has a traditional pedigree when it doesn't, as we prove.
The great, holy, and most divine Second Vatican Council.
Since he doesn't have the faith, he is unable to see and perceive that the Vatican II sect just isn't the Catholic Church, despite the mountain of evidence, so he is moved to defend its ridiculous heresies and novelties. There's a lot more we could cover to refute Wagner's errors and lies, and we will cover more if necessary, but that's all for this video. To be a true Christian and be saved, one must be a traditional Catholic, as our material explains. We also recommend that Catholics, if they can, pray 15 decades of the Rosary each day and the Hail Mary frequently.